Good morning, everyone. Welcome on our webinar on OT security risks linked to remote access and maintenance. This morning we have a nice webinar prepared, and in a minute we will start, but just maybe a few housekeeping rules at the start. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and afterwards you will receive a link, so you don't need to take notes, up to you, but you will get a link and you could listen back if needed. Secondly, you will also receive a question for a survey to give us feedback. We appreciate your feedback afterwards. And lastly, during the webinar, feel free to ask questions. There is a chat box, a question box in the GoToWebinar panel. So please submit your questions and we will come back to that in the end of the webinar in some kind of panel. Okay, let me go to the next slide. Let's get started on our webinar. Who are going to present? Well, you saw it already in the announcement that it's two companies that are going to present in this webinar. I myself, as the Managing Director of Secura, will kick off this webinar, followed by our OT security expert, Miguel Merticaru. And then our friends from the UK will continue the webinar, Ben Dunlop and Tim Canning from Trinity Digital Security. As Secura, we focus in this webinar a bit more on the design of remote access, and Trinity will focus a bit more on remote access in practice. So those are the two aspects that we will address and cover in this webinar. Okay, one slide about Secura, just to explain who you have in front of you. We are a competency center in digital security, in cybersecurity. We have quite a few experts that help you to provide insight into your security. So in practice, we offer advisory services, audit, testing, and training, all with the aim to help you determine the level of your security in your organization and help you to improve that. We do that in the world of IT and also in the world of OT. We love cyber physical systems, to be clear. And because of that, we have a whole range of services in the industrial world, of which some of them are mentioned in this slide. To mention a few, we have OT risk assessments, we have maturity assessments, we offer a NIST compliance audit, had to test against the NIST, the European NIST directive. We have, of course, testing services, red teaming in OT, and also we have a quite unique awareness and behavior program. During the webinar, I will say a little more about that, but altogether a quite comprehensive set of services to help you improve your security in your organization. Okay, speaking about operational technology. Well, I think you all know that operational technology is everywhere. You find it everywhere in society, in all kinds of industries, in all kinds of domains, and it's technology that controls the physical world. In many cases, it's pretty critical technology, critical systems, critical infrastructure, or life critical even. But in many cases, there depends a lot on the technology that operates these systems. So those systems have to be very reliable, safe, resilient, but also secure. Here's some more industries in which operational technology is being used. But what they all have in common is that in the past, most of those systems were not connected to the internet. Nowadays, most of them are. And connection to the internet brings risks. Those risks are not theoretical, they are real. I assume that you know some of those examples. Stuxnet is well known 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago already, but well known for 10 years. Then 5 years ago, we had the blackout in Ukraine, followed in 16 as well. Then in 17, 18, we had attacks in the Middle East. And honestly, those attacks are everywhere. Some of them succeed, some of them are just an attack, but the risk is real, is severe. And it's not just by accident that those things happen, but there are really organized groups, cybercrime groups that focus on those kind of things, also on OT. One of them is Dragonfly. They're known for severe attacks. And of course, they use, and that's written here in this document that you see on the slide, VPN and remote access to enter systems, among others, of course. They also use spear phishing and other technologies or other tricks to enter the network. But in the end, remote access is a very nice way for them to enter systems, because they can do it from a foreign country and they can never be caught by the police. So remote access is in all cases, in all attacks, very attractive to do the attack. And for that reason, they use vulnerabilities like were discovered last year in Pulse VPN, like were discovered in Citrix. And recently we published a critical vulnerability in Windows Server named Zero Logon. Well, those kind of vulnerabilities in the end are very interesting for those criminals if you don't patch your system, because then you're still vulnerable and they might be able to access your system. But that's what you don't want. So that's why in this webinar we give some hints, best practices on how to organize your remote access in a secure fashion. Well, during this talk, we will talk about OT networks or industrial control systems, ICS networks, and in general, they have a layout like what you see on the slide here. On the bottom, there are the sensors, the actuators, the loops, control loops, and then well, they feed into the PLCs, those feed into the control systems, and those may be linked to the office network and to the outside world, if the setup is in a clean manner. Through firewalls, through VPNs to the outside world. But the story is, of course, that just a firewall, just a VPN is way insufficient to have secure remote access. So what is more needed to organize remote access in a good manner? Well, those are our best practices. And I will start, and then our expert will continue on the technical part. In our view, if you want to set up systems in a secure manner, it's always a matter of people, process, and technology. Those are three pillars that all need to be in place in a balanced manner. You could compare this with a tripod, like a tripod that stands on three legs. And if one of them is missing or failing, the whole tripod will collapse. So you really need to have all three in place in a good, strong, connected manner to ensure security of your assets. And that's why in all our advisories, in all our audits, we pay attention to all three aspects. It's not one of them, it's them together. To start with the people aspect, well, first of all, it makes a lot of sense to identify, if it comes to remote access, on who do we want to provide remote access and for what. That's what you have to have very clear, your target groups and what they should get access for. If that is identified, then you can define policies on how to provide them access. You should train them on how to use it in practice, and that they are aware of what they are doing, and that they cannot, that they do not make mistakes in that. So the people aspect, that they know what they are doing, why they are doing it, the context, what the surroundings are, is very important to organize security in a good manner. So it's not only a matter of just training and awareness, the knowledge aspect, but in the end, it's also very much about behavior. And at Secura, we have a special program for that to help people behave in the right manner, because behavior is more than knowledge. It's also about motivation of people. It's also about ability. And that all plays a role in whether people behave well, secure or not. To give an example, if your operators have to run certain procedures, it might make sense that you invite them for an afternoon for a hacker session. We can explain, we can demonstrate how to hack such systems, and when they know what can go wrong and how people could misuse those systems, They may understand the rules and the procedures much better than when you just provide them the procedures. So by giving targeted advice to targeted groups, well, you motivate them better and you get more implicit secure behavior. So this is one example on how you can influence well, people's behavior and make that sufficient for secure remote access. That's one. The second is about process. So of course, in your OT environment, you have lots of standard operating procedures. This world is known very much for the procedures, but whether they all are sufficiently focused on security is a different thing. So you may want to update your procedures that the right security controls are in. And honestly, you don't have to invent them yourself. There are lots of standards, guidelines, best practices around that you could use, that you could copy from to implement the right procedures on your site. And of course, that should be done on paper, but in the end, also in practice. So practice what you preach, do it, live the example, especially manage by example, give the right example to your staff, and that will create followers. So have the right procedures is one, live accordingly is the second, and well, what might make sense is to also have that audited or certified, because that in the end gives the proof that you act accordingly, and that keeps it alive. If you have an annual audit, then generally there are some internal audits as well, and you pay more attention to those things than if you just say the book of the SOP is somewhere in the cupboard. That is not enough. You really need to live those procedures. And that holds also for third parties. So third parties are not just externals and, well, leave them alone. And no, if you provide them remote access, you have to manage them properly as well. With what kind of hardware do they log on to your systems? Who gets access? Make those logins personal, multi-factor authentication. If people leave such a company, then make sure that you take them off the list, that you revoke their rights, their access rights, and in such a manner, well, manage the accounts in a proper, healthy manner. So that's about the first two pillars, people and process. And as I said, it's a tripod. There's a third pillar that is as important, which is called technology. From here on, I hand over the mic to Miguel Matikaru, our OT expert, and he will explain you more about how to organize remote access from a technical point of view. Miguel.
Thank you very much, Deriken. And thank you all for being with us today. Yes, as Deriken mentioned, the remote access technology is important for the overall three pillars picture. So when we speak about remote access technology, it's important to understand, first of all, the needs, the capabilities, and also we have to really prepare the solution design for remote access. To define this proper and secure way, we have also to understand very well the communication that goes through. So considering the technology, we also have to think very much about the segregation of the data that's flowing to the network. Therefore, we have to understand what is the high sensitive data that is important, and that one has to be really segregated from the rest of the communication going through. Not just that, also we have to know how and the best way to segregate, to segment the network that we are having in our environment. For doing so, for example, we have a safety location that have to be always segmented from the rest of the network, and only dedicated communication to go through. Speaking about the remote access to this location, it's also very important. So we have to really take in consideration all the necessary steps to make this secure. We always have to use multi-factor authentication. It's not recommended at all to use just one simple password authentication. Always use multi-factor authentication. It's also important to understand who is going to use this remote access. Therefore, we have to create a very detailed, centralized access management to the people that are going to use our remote access. With this, we can use a lot of technologies on the market, like Active Directory, Radius, many others. But please do not forget that there are a lot of legacy devices that might not be able to use management access technologies. So for that one, you have to really think and create a secure way of being accessed. We have to understand the environment, and all the connections that are remotely created, they have to be monitored in such a way that at any time we should be able to find who and why they are connected to our environment. Therefore, we have to use only approved devices. So before connecting, those devices has to be checked in a technical way to see if they are in a proper state as the IT department is requiring. And besides that, we should always do not forget to test these remote accesses, because everything always can go wrong. So before giving access to devices and people, always test it before. Next slide, please. So continuing with next slide, please. Continuing with the technology, we know that virtual private networks are always the best way to secure your communication from outside the environment. But we have to be aware of a lot of, because on the market there are a lot of VPN vendors. Therefore, some of them they are known that they are not very secure. So be sure that you choose the best solution for your environment and the best secure also. Whenever we are already connected to the environment, there are a couple of other technologies that could be used to connect to the devices existing in our environment. So we could use remote access softwares like PC Anywhere, Admin, and many others, team viewers, and also using the well-known remote desktop connection from Microsoft. And again, do not forget to use the approved devices and approved people to be allowed to connect to. Coming next to next slide, please. To how to keep our network clean. Because okay, we could connect to a lot of devices, but at the same time, even the devices themselves could interfere and create bridges in our environment. So to keep the environment clean and tidy, it's important to understand the design and also to know what we have connected to our environment. And we can do this by monitoring our network and knowing all the devices available, but not knowing just devices that are connected to the network. It's important also to see the status of them. So basically, we have to know the update status, the software status, the firmware status of them. So we have to have a really patch and update management in place that it's properly configured. And also, do not forget in the critical infrastructure to test before deploying the patches. Is important because the patches could create issues and that can make problems in the environment. Also, it's important to know that and to have an antivirus software installed that could detect malware. And again, this has to be updated up to date always. Speaking back to the monitoring part, yeah, we have a couple of technologies that we could use, like the IDS, IPS firewall to block the traffic that is not needed. So a proper configuration of the rules in firewalls we make also help the remote access connection to work in the process and policies that we are thinking about. The monitoring also could be connected to the a SOX or CM system that will trigger alarms for the operators that are monitoring the system. And always do not forget to test and audit all these requirements, all these configurations. Usually it is very good to do this with a third-party company, independent company that will be doing this test to find out all the vulnerabilities and also coming up with the very nice mitigations for the existing vulnerabilities. Taking consideration of adding new devices in the systems, for example, it's recommended to have a very good threat modeling for how that device is gonna act in your system, or what kind of threats can include on put in your system. So before introducing new devices in the system, please do a threat modeling of them. And of course, a red teaming, which is trying to interact and access those devices in a more active way. And this is you can consider it also like a fire drill. So you see how those devices are reacting whenever something could happen. Going further, for this, we have, like we already mentioned, a lot of standards that could help you. Many international standards like ASC 62443, NIST directives, and many others from many countries and regions. Next, we mentioned the next slide, please. We mentioned the introducing new devices in this environment nowadays, because of the industry 4.0 that is very common. A lot of IoT devices are adopted in the critical infrastructure, but they are also coming with a lot of security breaches. And you always, for example, we can have a lot of sensors, cameras, devices that are integrated, and always try to understand them, always test them. Do not introduce some devices that are not tested, because they could trigger a lot of issues. Some consider the IoT cybersecurity as a cycle. So always try to keep them periodically, verify them periodically, and update them if it's possible. Multiple IoT devices, they are not able to easily update them. Doing so, you have to always conduct a cybersecurity acceptance test for this devices to understand how they can help you and how they cannot help you, basically, or how can they introduce some vulnerabilities in your environment. Always, best practices is always basically think about the risk and how you can control it. Don't forget multi-factor authentication. This is very important nowadays. Do a clear risk threat analysis for every change that you think, and understand how that affects. And think also to balance the bandwidth, because these devices are consuming a lot of it and trying to communicate a lot. So make a balance of your network. Next slide, please. So a summary, a very fast summary is okay. Best practices is the three pillars that we already discussed, of all of them. Therefore, please take them in consideration and do the due diligence with them in your mind. Thank you very much. Ben, is your floor.
Thank you very much, Miguel, and thank you very much, Dirk, Jan, for your presentations. And thank you to everyone that's joined our webinar. Hi, I'm Ben Dunlop, Managing Director of Trinity Digital Security. Trinity has been running for 12 years. We provide independent, objective guidance across operational technology and industrial control systems, including professional consultancy, managed security services, and technology. Our highly qualified OT security consultants have a background in controls and instrumentation and a combined 35 years of industry experience across a wide range of verticals, including oil and gas, utilities, healthcare, and power and energy. They're subject matter experts in ICS, automation, SCADA, DCS, HMIs, PLCs, and securing critical national infrastructures. They perform both onshore and offshore OT security audits and risk assessments, workshops, and training, along with compliance activities relating to 62443 and the NIST framework, and also hold a combination of GICSP, CUV Rhineland Functional Safety Engineer, and BOSIET certifications. I'm now going to pass over to Tim Canning. Tim is a GICSP certified OT security and safety expert with 32 years experience in the controls and instrumentation space and practical knowledge of the real world challenges facing companies in relation to remote access. Tim, in the previous section, we discussed the need for the 3 pillars. Looking specifically at the people pillar and the fact that implementing the security needed to make remote access safe might change how work tests tasks are carried out, what lessons have come out of the various projects that we've worked on in OT security? Over to you.
Morning, Ben. Good morning, everybody else. Thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, that's a great question. I wish we could go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we've carried out or experienced over quite a number of projects working on implementing security, some of which have also required us to implement secure remote access, is that there are more people that use industrial control systems in organizations than I think we'd understand. So we have to make sure that when we're putting security controls in place as part of any kind of technical project, is that we bring the people with us and we turn this into a journey. Otherwise, as you'll see with the picture on the slide, people will find ways to do their job the easiest way they can, and they won't necessarily be the ways that we want them to. And potentially some of them will be bypassing the security measures that we're putting in place. And consequently, we could cause ourselves a security risk that we don't necessarily know about by inadvertently making life harder for people than it really needs to be. So next slide, if we could, please. So we need this to be a joint journey, and we need to understand that some of the things that we're doing are going to make life change for some people, and it will change their normal. Hopefully we aren't going to be dragging people to security. Hopefully people will understand, if we do our project right, what the need is, what the drivers are. But change in general causes anxiety, and especially if people feel that they're not being taken account of in the change design that's coming through. So we need to be reassuring, we need to communicate at all times, but we also need to understand what people need and make sure that our project encompasses that. So next slide, if we could, please. In a particular project that we did some time ago, there was a metering system that we had offshore, and we were aware that there were people onshore remotely accessing this system offshore on a gas production platform to pull information away. And we made an effort to identify all the stakeholders, and we communicated, we published, we put posters up, we asked people to get in contact. And even so, on the day that we changed the password to prevent the remote access, and then started implementing some of the security measures around that to make that access much more tightly focused and limited to people that we understood were in need of having that access, which was a much smaller list than the people that had the access previously, there was still one person that ended up coming to my desk to say, you've turned the password off. You have to tell me the new password right now, because I do this thing every day that means I have to access this system. And so despite what we'd done in the way of understanding the job roles and the people and all of the stakeholders in what we were doing, there was still somebody that hadn't got the message. But even then, afterwards, we found ourselves in a situation where even people that we'd identified as needing some other method of accessing, we hadn't necessarily provided them with the right information coming away from this system to still be able to do their job as a routine. But what we were able to do was then go back, cycle back through that and say, okay, what are you actually doing? Where are you doing it from? When do you do it? So what's the timeliness of this? Why are you doing it this way? And in a number of cases, we were able to point them to other, better, richer sources of information that were easier to get to, that were already there and had been there for some time. So if we could have the next slide, please. And we, at delivery day, as I say, there was still one person that hadn't got the message. But that was about us getting ready. I've deliberately made the getting ready the big cog, because preparation is everything. So at the point that you're going to implement these security measures, ideally, everyone will have been consulted. You will have identified and understood every role that's going to need some kind of access and provided it, or provided some alternative means to get the information that people are reaching in for without them needing to actually go into the OT space to get it. We need to support that change, because on the day that people need to do it, people have got their day-to-day work to do. They're not necessarily ready for the change. They think they are. They've been trained. We've done all the communication, but you still need somebody there to almost hold their hand from a behavioral point of view to help them get used to the new normal. And that's about communication, making sure people understand the day is the day, what the date is, when is it actually going to change? When do they have to start using the new rules? If we could have the next new slide, please. And then once you've carried out the changes, we need to go through a cyclic plan, do, check, act, response type circuit to make sure that we follow up, that we find out whether we've actually provided everything somebody needed, whether they're getting what they want, and then coach them through the improvement process by which they can get that change that may make it even better, or actually give them back access to what they really need. And it has to be an ongoing learning process. As we've said, the security situation is never stable. The only thing we can say is that it's not going to be the same today as it was tomorrow, and the day after that will be different again. So we have to have an ongoing learning process, and it has to be cyclic, so that as we're exchanging the security environment, we're still making sure that people can do the day-to-day business of the company, because at the end of the day, security is a supporting mechanism. It's not the end game in its own right. We don't do security in most of our businesses for security. We do it as a means to do our day-to-day job without incident and without interruption. Okay, next slide, please. So I'd like to just talk through a couple of the risks, as this is just us. And one of the big risks that we've come across on many occasions is that we're trying to reverse security into systems that were never designed to have it, some of which are getting old, some of which have been there a long time. So we're in a world where obsolescence is a real issue, and we need to recognize that obsolescence brings with it a lot of problems, but potentially some opportunities as well. But when we're looking at making changes to older legacy systems that may be required, even if it's just down to physically fitting things like firewalls or protocol gateways, or changing unmanaged switches for managed switches, we need capability. We need someone that understands that system, what it does, how it does it, why it does it, and possibly understands how to reconfigure it for our new normal, our new way of doing things. In any project, planning is always important. But if we have obsolescence issues and we have capability limits, either in our own people or in our support vendors, then planning can become hard, and planning can become disrupted as we learn more about the systems, because our capability and expertise possibly wasn't as good as it could be, or we would like it to be when we were planning the project in the first place. Now, in any legacy system, if you're going to start interacting with it, there is the risk that some part of it, that when it gets disturbed, will fail. So in an obsolete world, spares can become a critical part of making sure that you're ready to deliver that change. And that if there is some kind of failure, firstly, that you've got the capability to fix it using spares, and that you've been able to sort of source the spares for the project. Now, with obsolete systems, with manufacturers that don't exist anymore or don't support that particular product anymore, that can be hard. So you may end up with a difficult conversation with the operational world about the fact that you're increasing the likelihood of failure because you're making engineering change, but that you now need to call on their pool of operational spares, which may change the life cycle of the system. You know, if there's an understanding that you have spares for 10 years because your failure rate is X, now a project's coming along that might increase that failure rate by doing some kind of engineering change to the system. Maybe the obsolescence review needs to read that the life cycle of that system is halved. And that means that we have to be honest with the people that own the budget. And we have to make sure that that's wrapped into our planning and our consideration of capability all the way back, and it's all driven by obsolescence. And finally, we need to understand that when we're out to do the changes and make the implementations that we've got to do for installing and updating or bringing in security measures, we may have to consider what else is going on the operating plant, because at the end of the day, as we said, security is not an end in itself. It's a supporting function for a business that does something else, whether it's oil or gas or transporting people or one of the myriad other places that we find OT. So SimOps, simultaneous operations, needs to be considered, because that again can reverse back into our planning, which could impact our budget. And it may mean that we have to hold on to supplier capability for longer than planned. And if that's limited because they don't have much of it, that might be difficult. So planning and understanding obsolescence up front isn't just about whether we can actually modify something or not. There are many other facets that must be taken into account in a successful project. All of this whilst trying to keep people informed about what's about to happen to their working environment and the things that they do and the day-to-day tasks they do and how they're going to change. Thank you. That's my part of the webinar complete.
Thank you, Ben and Tim. Thank you for your part of the presentation. I think we have seen now two sides of the coin regarding remote access, the design and setup part of the coin, and the more the practical side, like presented by Ben and Tim. Thanks a lot for that. I was just trying to wrap up for myself to provide a bit of a summary. At the start, we said that OT security is getting more and more important because systems get connected. On the other hand, Tim said it's not the end goal. It's a means. Security is a means to get things done, to organize things in a secure, safe, reliable manner. So indeed, those sides are there. We don't drive security for 100%, but it should be sufficient to for your operations. That was one lesson I think that we can draw from this webinar. The second is that in the end, it's a matter of people, process, and technology. We have to pay attention to all three in a balanced manner to ensure security of your systems, your assets. A third lesson that I've drawn is that security is not a static thing. It's not like you define it once, you design it once, you implement it once, and then it can run forever, especially not with remote access. It should be a dynamic living thing. I think you should or could compare OT security with a living organism. As long as you keep it alive, it's healthy, it's good. But as soon as you stop maintaining it, stop working on it, it may die. It's not sufficient to just follow the procedure. It's not sufficient to just do what was written down 10 years ago. You have to understand why things happen in the way they happen. You may have to revisit some of the procedures, some of the technologies, because of changing threat landscapes, because of changing technologies, because of new components in your system, but you have to keep that competency alive, although you may have a very stable environment. So that's our recommendation, at least. Thank you for listening so far. I see a few questions that came in. Let me start with the first one that came in already, 20 minutes ago. And the question is, do you agree that some MFA solutions, multi-factor authentication solutions, are dated and not safe? Miguel, could you answer that question?
Yes, of course, I can. Basically, yeah, multi-factor authentication, as I already mentioned, is requiring 2 factors for somebody to authenticate. And this means that could be somewhere what you know, or somewhere what you have, or somewhere what you are, like password, key token, or fingerprint, and also could be something where you are. Nowadays, multi-factor authentication are used also the location, GPS location. But indeed, there are a lot of solutions that are not very secure, and there are a lot of attacks like man-in-the-middle endpoint attacks, or SIM swapping attacks, or I don't know, account password recovery attacks, or hijacking the connection, and API attacks could I don't know, have an effect on bridging the authentication, of course. But the recommendation are always use secure and well-known softwares that are on the market. Update them all the time, and let's hope that not new threats are gonna be known recently for that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question. In which cases do you not allow to use remote access? When do you instruct your third-party vendors to come on site? Tim, could you answer that one?
Yeah, certainly. We need to consider what the impact on the operating site could be before we allow remote access and we start allowing remote engineering. We also need to understand what the capability of the local plant operators could be, or whether even that there are actually plant operators on that site at all. You know, if we're talking about an upstream oil and gas platform, by and large they're manned, but we might be talking about some kind of downstream pumping station in, say, the water or the gas utility sector that isn't normally manned. So if during one of our engineering changes made remotely, something happens that's unexpected, which is always a possibility, then maybe that site's going to trip. And at that point, maybe we need to have had someone on site already to make the recovery. And one of the things that we always need to understand with remote access and remote engineering is that the work is still taking place on the industrial site. The physical person that's making the changes or doing the work might be in an office somewhere a long distance away, but the work is happening to the industrial piece of kit. And there are plenty of examples of people working on industrial control systems remotely and doing something unexpected or something unusual happens, or a communications link fails halfway through a download that causes a machine to trip. So we need to make sure that we've got that capability understood to respond if something unusual happens. That's just maybe one consideration as to whether we would grant access or not, I think, Dirk.
Thank you. Let me go to the next question. Do you recommend active scanning on ICS? I suggest that there's one for Miguel.
Yeah, nowadays we have a lot of products that could do that in a very friendly way for the ICS. Normally, this is not recommended at all, especially in an online production system. But yeah, this can be done mostly in the design phase or after, for example, a factory acceptance test procedure. This can be done. And that moment we know exactly that the system is not online in the production, so it cannot affect. But whenever we have the system in production, and there are lots of factors that can affect the environment, the people around, then active attack should be very carefully considered. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I see a question which I somehow would like to answer myself. For cybersecurity, there's also the aspect of regulatory compliance, for instance, the NIS directive. What is the panel thought on that? Well, at Secura, we work on NIS audits, for instance, to help our clients to comply to the NIS directive, which is converted into local laws in all European countries. And actually, well, it's good that that directive is there, that those laws are there, that, systems have to comply to certain levels of security. But the directive itself is pretty unclear if it comes to how that level should look like. So in most countries, it's the supervisory authorities that say, well, that means in practice that you have to comply to certain norms. But the truth is that, well, this is still pretty early days, pretty limited. Every country has appointed operators of essential services, and, well, most countries haven't appointed too many yet. And then they're advised to implement certain security controls, or at least to have security controls in place. But it's not that strict, not that clear yet. What we expect is that over time, the number of essential operators will grow, and also that the level to which they have to comply may become more serious. And we think that that makes a lot of sense, because honestly, those people run critical processes, and there are even many more critical processes in society that may be life critical, or maybe lesser essential, but still critical for society or for safety. It might make a lot of sense to have good regulations in place for that, to ensure that everyone complies to certain minimum requirements. So right now, that is still at the start, we would say, but give it 5 years, give it 10 years, then we expect that there will be more regulation in place, and that companies have to demonstrate in a more clear way that they comply to certain minimum levels. So there is a good reason to have those things in place. I go to the next question. What's your opinion on remote updating of PLCs? Should that be allowed? Miguel?
Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah, I would say from experience that this should not be allowed, because yeah, whenever you're remote connected to the PLC and you try to update the PLC, that PLC could restart, reboot in such a way that is not coming back, or can affect the overall, or at least that part that is controlling part of the production of the environment. So therefore, updating it remotely, it's very risky. Potentially, any kind of rollback scenario could not be applied. Therefore, it's very recommended to have a dedicated person on the premises to do this, especially for the PLC's update. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, time is over. Maybe a last remark from Ben or Tim, but then I would like to finish off this webinar. If not, then I suggest that. Sorry.
I was just going to say, David, thank you very much to everyone for attending this webinar, and for all the questions that have been fired over. And I hope they've enjoyed it as much as we have.
Yeah, thank you. From our side too. Honestly, we have about 6 questions more asked. Sorry, we can't answer them all right now. What we will do is, in the link that we will send to you with the recording of the webinar, that we will send the answers as well. Thanks very much for attending, and hope to meet you next time again. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.